Hello, everyone. I'm Roger Cohen, the host of the Athens Democracy Forum. I must begin with an apology. Pretty poor showing for a host not to appear in person. In my defense, I'll just say that I've recently recovered from COVID and unfortunately for the first time this year was unable to make it. But I am there in spirit, and I'm joined this morning by Anand Giridharadas, the author. We're both in Brooklyn, New York, where it is 7:30 in the morning, and we're up and at 'em. I've known Anand for quite a while. We last met in Boston, in Cambridge, more precisely. And since then, Anand has become, I would say, the face of an idea. And that is that in what he calls market world, a class of rich philanthro-capitalists have pulled a big heist by presenting themselves as the solution to the very problems they've created. They assuage their consciences with do-goodism while safeguarding the system that made them fabulously wealthy and has left others very poor and marginalized. Anand, I'd like to begin by asking you how you came to this radical conclusion and explain a little what your core idea is.
You know, I think I observed something, a double-barreled paradox that began to alarm me increasingly in recent years. And I don't think anyone watching this will be unfamiliar with either half of the equation here. The first part of the paradox is that we live in this age in which it is impossible to walk down the street without bumping into a billionaire trying to change the world. And they do it through philanthropy. So we see these big gift announcements all the time. They do it through impact investing, all these buzzwords you might have heard about, impact investing, social enterprise, social venture capital. You see it with big corporations. You go to the website of any big corporation, there's some tab very prominently about some community activity, people in matching t-shirts digging something once a year. The worse the company is, if the company is actively killing people with opioids, for example, then the do-gooding is going to be even more. And so on and so forth. So we live in this age in which the richest and most powerful people in the United States, and this exists in versions around the world, are giving back, engaging in extraordinary elite generosity. But now the second half of the paradox that I observed, this also happens to be, as anybody listening to this also knows, an age of extraordinary elite hoarding. The same class of people, in some case, the actual same people, are increasing their chokehold on wealth and power every year, increasing their chokehold on the nation's political system, increasing their stratospheric wealth and the levels of inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality. And so, busting unions, so on and so forth. And so the question I was left with, if those two things are just descriptions of the world, which I think they are, the interpretive question, the question for an investigation was, what is the connection between these two things? Is it that, yes, we have all these problems, but Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and others are trying, and if they could only work harder and do better and give more, then we would solve them? Or the thesis that I decided to investigate, is it possible that this extraordinary elite generosity, this wave of do-gooding, is how we uphold a system of extraordinary elite hoarding? In other words, is the doing good, the wingman of protecting these people's ability to do harm? Is the making a difference the wingman of protecting these people's ability to make a killing at the cost to communities? And is all of this talk of changing the world fundamentally for them about doing just enough good, dousing just enough anger, placating people just enough to have their world and their system not change?
But Anand, are you really suggesting that these people do no good? You alluded obliquely there to the Sackler family and OxyContin, and of course the Sacklers underwrote the Tate in London. But let's take Bill and Melinda Gates. Do you actually believe they had nefarious intentions in giving more than $50 billion to charitable causes?
It's a good question. And so, to borrow a phrase from Paulo Freire, this kind of elite do-gooding brings together the naive and the shrewd, right? And so, and there's a whole spectrum of problems involved in this kind of elite charade that I describe in the book. So, and it's important to distinguish these things while acknowledging that they all belong to a basket of the same problem. So if you look at the Sacklers, they are on one end of the spectrum relative to Bill Gates in this group. Absolutely, right? So with the Sacklers, all the devils are here. You have, very base reputation laundering going on. They are using arts charities.
Reputation laundering.
Yes, it's even more lucrative than money laundering, right? They are using the Tate as a drive-through reputational laundromat to cleanse the stink that, if left on their bodies, would result in criminal prosecution or vigorous democratic action against them and their interests. So you use the Tate as a drive-through reputational laundromat, and you cleanse your stink, and it allows you to keep going, have some immunity for years. They, hundreds of thousands of people through the opioid crisis for years without anybody doing anything. So
let's not dwell on the Sackler family. I mean, what about the Gates? What about you spoke critically about impact investing and the word social that appears everywhere. But behind all that, there are good things happening for people. People who are getting medicines they weren't getting before, people having access to credit they didn't have before, improvements being made to life in various parts of Africa, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think you dismiss all that, do you?
No, and I think this is where the more subtle part of my argument comes in. So the reputation laundering is one of the issues involved in this, and only applies, as you're suggesting, to some people. By the way, it applies to more people than we may realize. Bill Gates was not viewed the way he is viewed now when he was stepping down from active duty at Microsoft, a monopoly that asphyxiated competition and was taken on by the Justice Department. Antitrust may be a boring issue, but what it basically means is you are depriving people who want to start businesses and pursue their dreams of oxygen. And that actually is not a good thing to do. So let's not, completely whitewash Bill Gates. However, you're right that there are a lot of people who do real things, right? There's a difference between what Bill Gates is doing and Goldman Sachs putting on T-shirts and going to dig something in Harlem for a day. So even if the reputation laundering is not what's at issue, what remains at issue, even when the best actors are acting, even when they are doing real work, is the question of the power of wealthy people over public life, okay? So here we can separate, and this is a democracy forum, if you are Bill Gates spending money on a foreign country that does not have the democratic capacity to solve this problem on its own, and that is a real conclusion, and that would be the case with some of the medicine stuff he's done in Africa and elsewhere, I think that's much more acceptable than if you are Bill Gates and you in your brain have some idea about how Americans should be educated, how the American education system should be transformed, called Common Core, and you jam that through multiple state legislatures. Many of those states enact it without a proper debate, thus inflaming sentiment that ends up helping Donald Trump some years later. Or you are Mark Zuckerberg, who does have the reputation laundering issues, who goes into Newark and tries to reinvent schools and has almost no effect with $100 million. Or you are Jeff Bezos starting a preschool, free preschool for children from low-income families. In other words, starting a preschool for families of the kind of people you and your friends underpay. Even if you are not involved in the problems, even if you're not complicit in the problems, which I would submit if you add up all the problems, tax evasion, tax avoidance, lobbying, this and that, there's almost no one who's not involved in the problem at that level. But even if we were to imagine a billionaire who was not involved in any of those problems, at a minimum, they are exerting and intensifying their hold of power over public life in an era
Is
in
this what
which
you
there,
mean when, I mean, you often write that the system is rigged. I mean, is that what you mean by this rigging, what you've just described? That these
well,
very wealthy people have sort of substituted themselves for the state, a very much weakened state, and are doing what the state should be doing because the state, at least in theory, should represent everybody rather than a certain interest or a certain view of the world.
yes, and exactly, and you've covered these issues uh, for a long time. Where there has been, as you know, a 40-year war in the United States, but also elsewhere, on the idea of government. It's called neoliberalism. It's called, I kind of call it capital supremacy. It was an intellectual, moral, and political hijacking of the American political system and discourse by folks
Capital
who,
supremacy is a pretty loaded term.
it is, and it's a pretty loaded thing they did. When Ronald Reagan said, that government is the problem, as the person in charge of the government. When Margaret Thatcher said, even more radically, there's no such thing as society, right? This was a radical departure from the past, and their hijacking succeeded. We are still in the back of the plane that they are flying. And what happened was, over
So
time,
you're saying that for 40 years there's been a continuous trend in that direction? I mean, I think Margaret Thatcher said that about 40 years ago,
yes,
with
happens with
technology added onto the top of it.
what happens is for people who end up living under that intellectual regime, you have the people in the opposition ending up kind of moderating but consolidating the takeover. So when Bill Clinton says the era of big government is over, and actually follows that by saying, but the era of everybody left to themselves, every man for himself should never return. That is what it looks like when that idea jumps to the left, and people on the left feel like they need to nod to, gesture to that idea. Or when Barack Obama takes over, community organizer from Chicago, creates his first new office, the Office of Social Innovation in the White House. And on the website, it says top-down programs from Washington don't work anymore. A preposterous and false statement belied by the fact that Barack Obama was able to cast a vote for himself because of an extraordinary top-down program from Washington called the Voting Rights Act. So we have lived in this, in a way, consensus ideology that markets are the best way to deliver the public good, and the job of government is to get out of the way. And
That's what you call market world, right?
And so the question then becomes, given that this is a democracy forum, how do we reclaim the idea of democracy as morally superior, but frankly also as sexier, as more exciting to young people who want to invest their lives and time? How do we reclaim the idea that what we do together is actually more important than what we do alone? That the idea of running to be a city councilor is more exciting than the idea of going to Silicon Valley to create a stupid app. We have lived, I'm 39 years old.
So what's your answer to that question? I mean, that is the core question. I found your analysis and your criticisms very, very persuasive in many ways. But when it came to prescriptions, I find you much vaguer. And sometimes I ask myself, well, isn't he really saying that what we need in the United States is European social democracy? We need a more supportive society. We need people to pay more taxes. We need schools to be better, etc. So are you just, in effect, an American social democrat?
Yes and no. I mean, I am, but that's not the fullness of what I'm suggesting. I think that would be one of the likely outcomes if we did what I'm really suggesting, which is, as I say in the book, we need to return to democracy as the place we go to change the world. And that may sound vague, but it's not vague, in the sense that if you are a young person, 22 years old, out of college, deciding what to do with your life, you have a choice about whether you go start an app or whether you want to go work at the US Department of Agriculture, which sounds like a boring job, but actually has more power over the shape of people's lives, right? When you think about, you have children, a child this age, when you think about a 22-year-old today, I don't think any talented 22-year-old coming out of college would think about wanting to go work for the Food and Drug Administration in Washington as a job that fulfills their desire to have impact on the world, as a job that would be about changing the world, right? If you read Michael Lewis's great book, The Fifth Risk, where he actually explains what people in these jobs do, you will see that these people have way more impact over what all of our lives are like than any of the lodestars you're chasing in Silicon Valley. That's a tangible example of what I mean when we say we got to change where we go to change the world. But it also means that we in the media, have to tell different stories and valorize different people, right? We helped make, all of us, Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg is just a guy who can't look someone in the eye and try to create an app because he couldn't meet girls in person, and ended up becoming one of the most dangerous enablers of fascism on earth. Well, Mark Zuckerberg, was valorized by the media, built up into, entrepreneur, hero. He didn't do that. We all did that. Well, we need to think about who we're valorizing. We need to tell the stories of people who are actually choosing.
I mean, you're suggesting we should valorize the Department of Agriculture bureaucrat in, well, maybe we should drop the word bureaucrat to begin with, right?
Correct. And you know this from your long experience in Europe. In different societies, public life, public service have different statures, right? Have different.
Being a fonctionnaire in France is still the dream of many French people, to be a functionary.
And and I think we would often laugh at that kind of thing in America. But you know what?
Definitely.
Like, actually working on the commons. I mean, I was walking with my 5.5-year-old son yesterday through the park. And he said, as kids often do, these fascinating questions. He was like, what does public mean? And so we were walking through the park and we start showing him everything that's public, which is a lot of things, which is the park, which is the road next to the park.
Why did he ask that question?
We were talking about, I have no idea. He heard something.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's a great question. Yeah.
and he was like, what does that mean? Right. When he heard us talking. And it was very interesting explaining to him. And so then he said, okay, so is our house public or is our house private? I said, well, our house is largely private. And it was just interesting seeing a 5-year-old construct a world where there's some things we do together and there's some things we do alone. And if I'm making a plea in this book, it is to change the valuation, to use a business term that I loathe, but I'll use anyway, of the public and the private in our collective imagination, particularly in the United States, but not only. I have spent time in Europe over the last couple of years talking about this book. My assumption was always that this was less true in Europe, but people were saying to me in Britain, and in the Netherlands recently, that, this fetishization of entrepreneurship and denigration of the democratic pursuit of change is everywhere. This is spread from the United States. Like Coca-Cola and rock and roll. And it's really, really important, I think, to restore this idea of collective change-making, changes to whatever problems you see in your life that are public, democratic, institutional, and universal. Those types of changes, to have those be the kinds of changes that we respect most and are most eager to pursue, and that young people feel the most determined to make their lives seeking.
Anand, our title today is From Elite Charade to Real Change. And boy, has there ever been real change in 2020, this year. A pandemic brought the world to a halt. The recovery is pretty faltering. The old dispensation, to quote Eliot, is gone for now. And people are reassessing their priorities. They're reassessing the way they live, whether they travel, how they consume. So how do you think the virus has affected and maybe bolstered your push for a radical remake of capitalist societies, and particularly the United States?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about this year, COVID is obviously the defining story. But this has been a year in which, in the United States, at a minimum, there have been 5 intersecting crises. There's COVID as the immediate health crisis, but also the underlying health crisis of the United States that it revealed, right? The fact that in the early days, as you know, a lot of people wouldn't even go in for testing because they would lose a day of pay if they did, or they were afraid of a $10,000 bill, which actually happened to some people. The health crisis then caused an economic crisis, which itself revealed a deeper chronic economic crisis that's been true for a lot of people for a long time. Then you have the great racial uprising of the summer, this revolutionary summer, where the cry of Black Lives Matter actually, in addition to being a morally righteous cry, actually changed a lot of people's minds and has started to move white people in a way that is dramatic and important. You have the democratic crisis, acutely on display this week with the United States, for the first time in history, considering whether a peaceful transfer of power is going to happen, whether an election result is going to be honored, and then the climate crisis hovering over all of that.
Did you think that debate reflected a troubled society? The debate between President Trump and Joe Biden.
A lot of people, they just blame Donald Trump, but it reflected a society, to me, a body politic that is badly diseased. America is a cancerous society right now, and he is a boil on a very ill body politic. And so if you list those 5 crises, you say this is a bad time. But another way to think about it is this feels like one of those moments in history where an order is dying, where an ancien regime is dying, where an entire way of living is dying. If these 5 crises have anything in common, they are a loud cry in our ears that we have not been living right. We have not been living right in terms of race and equality. We've not been living right in terms of our relationship to the planet and food and sustainability. We've not been living right in our economy. We've not been living right health-wise. We've not been living right in the democracy that we cherish but have neglected. And so this moment is an opportunity of the kind that has often been seized upon in history, as you know, to bounce back and to
well, with what you're saying, you made me think of, Roosevelt obviously confronted a crisis of similar proportions when the New Deal was pushed through. What would be a contemporary equivalent of the New Deal that ushered us out of market world and the domination of what you call philanthrocapitalists? What would be the constituent elements of that?
Well, at the risk of embarrassing you, I will say that when I was starting out as a journalist, you were one of my absolute journalist heroes. I wrote you fan mail long before we were colleagues.
You are embarrassing me, Anand.
One of the pieces I wrote you fan mail.
Flattery will get you everywhere.
But one of the piece I wrote you fan mail about before I was even a journalist was from The Hague, and I think you were leaving Europe, and you wrote about the European Union all these years later, and there was this line that I'll never forget. You said, "Democracy really is dull, but it's enough." And I think the European Union is a profound example. I remember reading this book by Jean Monnet talking about the origins of creating this, pan-continental supra-democracy, where there was a real sense that we had not been living right. And in Europe, that was measured in millions and millions of murders. And there was a connection between those murders and the economic systems that had happened and the political systems and peace arrangements and wars that passed. And there was a recognition coming out of the Second World War that we have not been living right. It's not just about ending the war, right? And there was a coming together of labor and big companies and all kinds of people saying, the old is gone, the new will be different. We're all going to have to sacrifice, and we're going to build a new set of institutions. Now, the European Union is not fashionable today. It's failed in many ways to create an identity that people actually love rather than tolerate, and we can talk about that on a different occasion. But the basic achievement of taking a place that contributed to the lion's share of murder in the 20th century and turning it into a place that decided through the dullness of democracy to make decisions together. It's one of the great achievements of humankind, and a reminder of something that we too easily forget, which is like, we can do this. We have done this many, many times, and we can do this again. But we have to recognize the gravity of this moment. and recognize that this is going to take 2020 foresight. This year is an invitation to remake the world.
Let us imagine, and I hope for this fervently, that Joe Biden is elected President of the United States. If you were Joe Biden, what would you say in your inaugural address on January 20, and what would you try to accomplish in the first 100 days that really made clear that this is a break, that we've been through the crises you've just described, and that we need to forge something new in the same way that Monet and Schumann and de Gasperi and Adenauer and George Marshall created both the Union and the transatlantic community to defend it after World War II, to really mark a break?
I'm gonna answer that with regard to what I hope Joe Biden would do, and not, I have my skepticism about what his instincts to actually do this. But if I were him, here's what I would do. I think his fundamental skill. He's not my ilk. We have Real Change is the title of this panel. I don't know that he's a real change person at heart. However, something I admire profoundly about Joe Biden, and I'm quoting a random Twitter user who I wish I knew their name, but someone once said on Twitter that Joe Biden's chief political skill is remembering who the American median voter is, right? A lot of us can get caught up in our own wokeness, or get caught up in a Twitter bubble, or get caught up in thinking that, Americans are turning against capitalism, or that there's a, new consensus on race. And real change is slower. The median voter is somewhere 10 miles behind. And Joe Biden, unlike a lot of people in American politics, his mind is trained on that median voter. And that gives him a superpower to translate ideas that often sound scary to Americans into American. And so if there is anybody who wanted to do real change, I don't know that he wants to do the kind of real change we're talking about. That's a different issue. But if he wanted to come in and actually decisively put America on a path to solving the global climate crisis, a Green New Deal, if he wanted to come in and end the barbarism of people dying on the street because we don't have universal health care, if he wanted to think about things like a basic income or those types of policies, putting people to work rebuilding the country, there's actually very few people in American life who could talk about those things and convince Americans about them in a way that does not raise these fears of socialism, that does not make people have these basic turning into Venezuela. And I think that's going to be a test for him of whether he's willing to use those first 100 days, should he get them, to do the most dramatic, thrilling set of reinvention policies to actually make America good again.
Thank you so much, Anand, and thank you, everybody. Personally, I hope that Joe Biden gets that opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.